In this week's lesson, we want to continue what we began at the end of the last quarter in our literary analysis or rhetorical interpretation of Scripture. Last quarter, we began talking about two basic issues in literary analysis. Those issues are form and style. When we're studying the form of literary, we're talking about the organizational structure. I have posted on Moodle for this week last quarter's PowerPoint presentation concerning form, and if you would like, go ahead and review that before you begin doing the assignments. This week we're going to be talking about style for this week's lesson. The style of rhetorical interpretation or literature in the Bible is the particular verbal elements or the ways of expression. So when we're talking about style, we're talking about these particular verbal elements or these particular ways of expression found in the Old and New Testament. There are various kinds of literary genre or styles in the Bible, or ways of verbal expression. The first kind is called legal. In the Bible, we find a literary genre called the legal genre, or the legal style. This is in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the law. There are two kinds of legal material in the Bible. There's a pedagogic law, direct commands. For instance, you shall not. We find those in the Ten Commandments. And there's casuistic law, or case by case. And we find that in Leviticus, where there's case by cases, where it'll talk about cases in law, and in particular law that we find in the Pentateuch. Another kind of literary genre is narrative. Now, there are 6 kinds of narrative in the Bible. There's tragedy, a story of the decline of a person like Samson, Saul, or Solomon. There's epic, for instance, the wilderness wanderings in the book of Exodus. Then there's romance, Ruth, the Song of Solomon. There's heroic, Abraham, Gideon, David, Daniel, Paul. Then there's satire. This is an exposure of human vice or folly through ridicule or rebuke. We find this in Jonah. Then there's polemic. This is like an aggressive attack, like Elijah and the prophets of Baal. And this is where we see Elijah attacking the ideas and the methodology and the approach to God that the prophets of Baal had. And this is called polemical. Then there's poetry. There are several kinds of poetry or psalms. There's laments of the people. There's laments of individuals like David. There's declarative praise of the people, where the people are praising God. And then there's declarative praise of the individual. Another kind of literary genre or style or a particular verbal expression is wisdom literature. In wisdom literature, we find 2 kinds of wisdom literature. Proverbial. These are general truths based on broad experiences and observations, like we find in Proverbs. Then there's reflective, a discussion of the mysteries in the Bible, like we find in Job and Ecclesiastes. Another kind of literary genre we find in the Bible is called the Gospels. The Gospels are both doctrine and narrative presented to set forth information in the person and life of Jesus Christ. So in the Gospels we have narrative and doctrine, and these 2 ideas actually make up the Gospels. In other words, the Gospel is not just narrative, but it's narrative around the theme of doctrine, and particularly on who Jesus is. So the Gospels are giving us a good narrative of the life of Jesus, but also presenting us in that life of Christ the doctrine of who he is. Another kind of literary genre is logical discourse. We find this in epistolatory literature or epistles. There are 2 kinds of epistles. There's expository discourse. This expounds certain truths and doctrines with logical support for these truths. We find this in Romans. Then there's hortatory discourse. This includes exhortations to follow certain courses of action or to develop certain characteristics in light of the truths presented. We find this in the pastoral epistles where Paul is giving them exhortations on how to act and how to follow certain courses of action wrapped around the doctrines and the truths of the Bible. Another specific kind of genre in the Bible is prophetic literature. Prophetic literature is a material that includes predictions of the future at the time of the writing of the material, with injunctions often included that those who hear prophecy adjust their lives in light of the predictions. We find this in the minor and major prophets of the Old Testament, and certain prophetic literature inside the historical narratives of the Old Testament, as well as in the Pentateuch. Another kind of prophetic literature is called apocalyptic material, and this focuses particularly on the end times. We'll discuss this particular type of literature later in our study in another lesson.